So Halloween is coming up, and usually around this time I like to do a Halloween special. It's one of my favorite Young Heretics traditions to read a ghost story and talk about it, or tell you guys about some tradition from the history of the West, some folklore about ghosts and goblins and demons and spooky, scary stuff. And I was thinking, man, what am I going to do this year? I'm in the middle of this series on Homer's Odyssey, and I don't really want to interrupt it for the Halloween special. But, my friends, always trust Homer, because Homer will provide. It turns out, just in the natural course of telling Odysseus' story, we've arrived at a scarier story than any other I can think of. I can't imagine a better topic to tell you about for our Halloween special than the one that has just come up in Book 11 of the Odyssey. We have reached the literal darkest point on the hero's quest. It's time for the journey into the Underworld. So, when we last saw our hero, you may recall he had broken free at last of the clutches of Circe. They weren't very aggressive clutches at the time of departure. They had evolved from evil witchcraft and sorcery into something more like beguiling caresses. Odysseus spent a year with what was left of his crew on the island of Aea with Circe, but as we've been discussing the whole time, every journey, every moment in this quest is also a road not taken. And for Odysseus, the road not taken with Circe is the road of raw pleasure and a life of lust. He has to give that up. He has to give up all the other options he has to sleep with all these beautiful women and nymphs and goddesses in order to attain true love, true happiness, true peace at home with his faithful wife, Penelope. Now, he's not quite finished with that part of his quest, but he's made a major advance, which is over the raw animal lust of Circe's beguiling charms that turn men into pigs. And now his men have asked him to go home. They are pining as he was before he met Circe. He may have sort of lost track of that a little bit, and so his men have to remind him that they too are pining for home. It's a moment, I think, of reconciliation between the remnant of the crew and Odysseus, because there's been a lot of mistrust between them, a lot of unanswered questions after the war that they had to sort through, whether the crew really could trust Odysseus, whether he was just in it for his own gain. And finally, now at the end of Circe's island, they are going to go off together, following Circe's directions for how to get home. Because remember, they're lost at this point. Initially, they were making their way on a course that they understood, but now they've been blown off course. And so not only do they have to fight their way back through the treacherous trials and dangers, but they also have to figure out how to get home. And Circe guides Odysseus to the only place he can go to find this knowledge. And in the ancient world, and in life generally, if you want secret knowledge, if you want hidden things, you have to travel through danger and darkness into the unknown, because that's what Odysseus is going to do. He's going to go and meet with the spirits of the dead, and in particular, he's going to find the prophet Tiresias, who is in a bunch of myths. He features throughout the Greek mythological canon. He's kind of a stock character, kind of a mysterious figure. He reminds me a little bit of Q from Star Trek, in that Q comes from this outer region of almost godlike entities with kind of unclear rules, which suggests that at the edges of the known universe, there's this whole other hierarchy and order of being that totally scrambles our regular categories. Tiresias is a little bit like that. He keeps showing up in other guises, in different places, in different cities, and he always has the dark, hidden knowledge, and that's what Odysseus has to go and get from him. This is a kind of scene that is sometimes called a katabasis in Greek, which means a going down. And this is a stock scene that gets used again and again, not only in Greek and Roman literature. It's in, for instance, Virgil's Aeneid, but later, of course, it will be a major driver of poems like Dante's Inferno. It shows up again in modern reworkings of the myths and the idea of the hero descending into the great unknown and facing the possibility of oblivion. That's really what it is. It's letting go of your present situation, forgetting what you think you know, and entering into the world beyond the limits of your philosophy and your understanding, so that you can gain new knowledge. This is an image. It's so powerful that it can almost stand as a symbol for innumerable things. And this is how art often works. You get an image and you say, well, is this a picture of normal human life and knowledge gathering? Is it a picture of something more mysterious? The answer is yes. It's a template that we find repeated throughout human life. So even though our circumstances may change, you'll find this template again and again, because it's a spiritual template embodied in this myth. And the spiritual template that the myth embodies will then be recognizable to you as you travel through it, and maybe it will be a guide on your journey. That's part of the value of myth, is outlining these templates that endure throughout time and repeat themselves again and again, just in the structure of our experience. Technically, however, and this is often the case with the first example of something, technically this Odysseus story is not a katabasis, in the sense that Odysseus doesn't actually go down, kata, downward, into an underground realm to meet the spirits. He draws them up to him by making a sacrifice and drawing them to the blood of sheep, because the major theme of this whole story is that the dead crave life. They long for life. And what's so chilling about the Homeric vision of the underworld is that it is not a vision of life after death exactly. There are some beings, demigods, the sons of gods, some heroes that attain a life of their own. And there's a mention of that in the person of Heracles when Odysseus meets with the shades of the dead. But most people, that is most human beings, evaporate like breath upon death. And that was the major tragedy of the Iliad. And the whole idea of fame and glory in battle was supposed to be a compensation for this awful, awful loss of human life that happens every time a soul goes down to the house of Hades. And that's what Odysseus has to face here. He does it by enticing the dead up to his realm rather than going down to the realms beneath. And it's kind of ironic that this scene really is the archetype, the original version of all the other scenes that would come later. Because later on, we have this idea of the katabasis. Even in Plato's Republic, there is a famous opening line that includes the word katabaino, to go down, suggesting that perhaps Socrates is coming up from an underworld or cave of unknowing. And this theme of the murky unknowing beyond the limits of human reason is one of the obsessions of Greek myth, but it's slightly different in Odysseus than it is in all the other later ones. I just watched the Texas Chainsaw Massacre this past weekend, and it's sort of the first slasher film. It's not quite the first ever, but it really kicked off the genre and spawned a bunch of imitations and remakes and reboots. And similarly, when you go back to the first version of something, you realize, oh, this wasn't a type of thing yet. This wasn't a genre yet. This was just a scene. And there may be precedents for Odysseus' visit to the underworld, but we don't have them. So for us, it really is this fresh new idea, and you have to learn to experience it as a fresh new idea and not just as a series of tropes, because after that, it does become freighted, loaded with reference. But in the first instance, it's not a cliche, it's not a trope, it's a shocking and vivid picture of what the world might be like beyond the borders of death, the greatest unknown of all. Nobody quite knows what lies beyond there. And for the Greeks, the fundamental question that really is a question with no known answer that torments many Greek thinkers and authors, the fundamental question is beyond the borders of death, this bright little island of life that we live in, where things seem to make a certain degree of sense, where reason can figure things out, where there seems to be order to the universe. Once you pass outside the boundaries of human consciousness and human experience, is the bedrock of reality more life, more logic, more understanding, or is the human realm, the human region, the only place where life and logic and understanding exist? And outside the fundamental truth of things, underneath all of the bright forms and colors of the world, underneath there is illogic and chaos and unreason. And that is the most chilling and terrifying possibility of all, which Odysseus has to confront here too. He has to stare into the face of the great ocean which encircles the world and be confronted with the possibility that that's reality, that underneath our reality, there's a deeper reality. We all know that's true. We all know there's something outside of our experience. The question is it more like what we experience, that is life and living and feeling and thinking and existing in a realm of order and reason that is higher than ours? Or is it everything coming apart and reason ceasing to make sense and life extinguished altogether? So, if that's not a good enough Halloween thought for you to chill your bones, I don't know what is. We're going to get into it. But first, I want to make sure that you don't miss the deadline for the Ancient Language Institute's spring term. On December 14th, registrations are closing. They're open now, but they fill up quickly. And I could not be more sincere in my endorsement of the Ancient Language Institute's courses. First of all, if you've been enjoying this series on the Odyssey at all, if it's even sparked a little bit of your curiosity, I can promise that there is a vast ocean of excitement and knowledge out there if you learn the ancient languages. Of course, the Odyssey is written in ancient Greek, which they do teach at the Ancient Language Institute, but if you would also, or rather, like to get to know Latin and the great Latin epics, they teach Latin too. If you want to read the Bible in Hebrew, they teach that. They also, as of this year, have been teaching Anglo-Saxon, Old English, with a fantastic new innovative way of teaching that we're going to actually discuss on the show in a few weeks. I'm going to have the progenitor, the originator of this new technique for learning Old English on the show to talk about it. But you can learn Old English and read Beowulf. It's like a ticket of admission to an enormous worldwide generational party that's been going on for centuries and centuries. To learn these languages is a lifelong blessing, and ALI gives the best instruction I know of in these languages. It's ancientlanguage.com/youngheretics to register. That's ancientlanguage.com/youngheretics. You got to use that link to get my special offer. And you also have to be listening to the show, because I never write this down. It's a tightly kept secret, except for Young Heretics listeners. You can enter my name, Spencer, Spencer, and get 10% off your registration. You don't want to miss it. Sign up before the classes fill up. They're taking beginners. They're taking people of all skill levels. They're really good at working with people wherever you happen to be at, even if you think this might be a fun thing to do, but you just have no way of knowing whether you'd be any good at languages, or you're scared of foreign languages, you hated them in school. Ancient Language Institute isn't like that at all. It's innovative. It's highly intuitive the way they teach. They teach ancient languages like living languages, and they definitely can work with you, I promise. So go to ancientlanguage.com/youngheretics and register before December 14th for the spring term. So we pick back up with our hero on his way out from Eerie, which is a name I'm just going to say as many times as I have the opportunity to, because it's so fun. Eerie, the island of Circe, and she has sent him off to the limits of the known universe. This really would be like if she had put him in a spaceship and said, I'm programming the coordinates for the edges of all known existence. Because the Greeks had an idea sort of similar to our idea of the finite but unbounded universe, that there was this vast world out there, but it was encircled by a river, the river Okeanos. And this is where we get our word ocean, of course. And for us, an ocean just means any large body of water. But specifically for the Greeks in these myths, it meant the river that bounds and encircles the world. This is the limit of what can be known in human terms, or something like that. And there's a reason why the name of this river has become our word just for ocean in general, because the ocean, which we now, having mapped out the world and become lords and conquerors of the earth, we now can picture the ocean's shape on a map, and we can think, yes, it's a particular region, it ends here and here, there are continents, and then there's water, and there's all this sea out there. That's what we think when we sit in our comfortable rooms with our atlas or our internet or whatever, and we look at the world through the eyes of the Lord of it, as having some kind of, God's eye view on the world that the map gives us. But we don't realize that this is an enormous privilege and, in some sense, an illusion, or we're kidding ourselves if we think that's what the ocean really is, just a picture on a map. If you've been to sea, you know that the ocean is a vast and untamable power that it still remains awe-inspiring to stand at the edge of the sea and feel as if you're at the edge of the world. I had the privilege once of going to the Cape of Good Hope and to stare down at the southernmost tip of essentially the world and look out for miles and miles and just see water. You realize how people must have felt coming up against the ocean. It must have felt like literally the edge of the world. And so it becomes an incredibly pregnant and potent symbol for all kinds of mythological traditions, not just the Greek traditions, also the Near Eastern traditions like Babylon, and also the Bible. If you think about God's Spirit brooding over the waters, we have this idea of the primordial sea, the tohu vabohu in Hebrew, the earth being formless and void, is a kind of cosmic ocean. And God's Spirit has to infuse it with his light and order. Now, the Bible has a distinctive take on this whole cosmology relative to other stories that were being told in the Near East around about the time that Genesis might have been set down or composed. Because in other stories, like for instance, the Enuma Elish of the Babylonians and the Assyrians, this creation myth that you get from other Near Eastern, that is what we would now think of as Middle Eastern ancient societies, they told a story that the ocean was the first thing. In fact, usually you'll get Apsu and Tiamat, these two primordial forces of salt water and fresh water, mingling together as this kind of creative ocean power. And they fuse when nothing is named. So there's no structure, no names to things, no order. And they fuse, and out of that chaos, all sorts of things, good and bad, monsters and gods and all sorts of creatures come spewing out in a kind of generation machine, a production machine for all these different kinds of things. And that was the idea, that the bedrock or the underlying truth was the ocean, this formless cosmos, or this ever sinuous and flowing kind of reality, and it would spew out these different entities, and gradually one of those entities, one of the gods, maybe Marduk or Ashur, would rise up and impose order on the chaos. So the order comes second, the chaos comes first in some of these creation myths. But in the Bible, of course, God comes first. So the order, the logos, the mind, the davar, the word or the speech of God that gives shape to things, is primordial. It is the first and most truly existent thing, the core of reality. And then out of that comes this raw material of potential, this kind of ocean and swirling chaos that is then shaped according to God's divine plan. So that's the biblical point of view on creation, and it's different from, in fact, it's the opposite of, and self-consciously the opposite of. It's a revisionist history against this idea of primordial chaos being the true and real thing. And Odysseus is coming up now against that chaos, and it's unclear whether this is the limit of the world, is just chaos, swirling ocean, and darkness, or whether there's something else, some divine order. But the Greek cosmology would suggest that actually it's chaos first, and then out of chaos, out of this chasm of ocean, we get this, for instance, in Hesiod, that out of the chasm and the chaos come the gods, and the gods battle for supremacy and then impose order. So this seems to be kind of the general picture of things, and it makes you realize how distinctive our view, which comes from the Bible, is. We think the order, it persists, that the order that we perceive in the world, when we use logic, we use reason, maybe there's a grander design, but it's still a design. At the bedrock of reality, there's still a design. For other myths, pagan myths, that's not guaranteed. In fact, most likely the chaos, the darkness, is the first thing, and only human will or the will of some other superhuman entity can impose order by force on this chaos. So Odysseus is now coming up against the limits of that worldview, the edge of order, the edge of chaos, where the ocean holds sway, and there may even be an influence here. It's possible, an influence from the east, from the Enuma Elish and the Babylonian myth of Apsu and Tiamat, this idea that the ocean is the bounding of the universe and the ultimate truth of all things. So he walks through the land of the Cimmerians, who live in dark forever. It's this kind of ancient Norway, although that's not where he's not in Norway, but they never see the light of day. So that he's walking through this shadow world, to get finally to the place where he can summon the spirits of the dead, because they too live in and have returned to this primordial darkness and chaos. So I find it a little heartbreaking to contemplate. And I find this heartbreaking now when I hear people say things like there's no meaning to the universe, it's all just atoms moving around in flow. This is why I wrote my book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, was to argue that this is not the most plausible vision of the world, this pagan idea that we have merely chaos or merely randomness or merely physical motion, natural motion, that's the bedrock of reality. That has come back into force with the advent of sort of scientific materialism. And one thing I wanted to show in that book is that that's actually not a very scientifically plausible view either, because it matters very much what idea you have about the fundamental building blocks of existence. If you think that the order we perceive in the world is just one corner of a grand tapestry of design, then you can live a life of meaning and purpose and direction. If you don't, you can pretend, but ultimately, if we really are just random bunches of atoms, bundles of forces and chemicals, then all of our pretense at meaning is just a fiction. And that's what people like Yuval Harari are saying now, that we have to just make up fictions and narratives to convince ourselves of meaning, which is pointless. Any storyteller knows that the only reason to tell a story is if there's truth in it, if there's a reality toward which your story is referring. And so I find it heartbreaking in modernity to think about what it would be like to live as if outside the regions of our sight there's just chaos. And I also find it heartbreaking to think of Odysseus, whom I love so dearly, and Homer and the Greeks tangling with this. I think they really did tangle with it. I don't mean that they were only pure chaos agents. This is kind of what Nietzsche means when he talks about Greek pessimism. Nietzsche has this idea that the Greeks were pessimists, and he views them really as always haunted by the conviction, hard as they try to flee from it, that order is limited, and outside the span of human knowledge, there's just kind of chaos or arbitrariness or a vast open field of unknowing. But I don't think that's true. I think they were genuinely looking for a logos, trying to articulate a reason that went beyond humanity and out into the rest of the universe. They just had no certainty about it, as indeed we have no certainty about it. But we have faith, we have belief, and we have this other wisdom tradition from Jerusalem that teaches us why it's reasonable to believe. But without that, there is just always at the edges of your sight, at least, the horrifying possibility that really this life is the full extent of reason, logic, and meaning, and it's all imposed by battling gods or by human beings in a sort of arbitrary imposition of the will, and outside there is this chaos. So I find this tragic, and I find it terrifying, but I also find it really just riveting. Like, it's one of the most fascinating and fixating parts of the story, just like a ghost story, just like on the edges of the normal, you meet up with the uncanny and it sends a chill down your spine. That's why I love this moment with the Cimmerians, because it reminds me of a lot of other moments, like in the Gawain poem, there's kind of a moment like this, and they did this well in the movie of Gawain that they made, where you're on this quest, right? And you're in this fictional universe, and then you just get a hint, something at the edge of your sight that suggests to you that even this whole grand epic story is taking place in one little corner, one tiny region of a universe that expands out far beyond the limits of your sight. And out there, who knows? Maybe it's Q, who can bend the rules of space and time. Maybe it's giants, maybe it's dragons, maybe it's this people that live forever in shadow. There are just any number of possibilities in that outer darkness, and there's something so compelling to me about that as a story element alone. So the Cimmerians kind of usher us into, he walks past them almost in silence. They stand there like moaning on the edge of his sight, and he goes then to summon the shades of the Underworld. It reminds me very much of a few passages actually in C.S. Lewis's Paralandra. If you've read the Space Trilogy, you know I'm really into this fictional science fiction trilogy that C.S. Lewis wrote, especially the last one, That Hideous Strength. But Paralandra is the one that takes place on Venus, and it's a whole new Eden, essentially. It's a picture of what Earth would have been like if humanity had never fallen. So now that we've fallen, we've veered off onto that timeline, which is the Jesus timeline, the timeline of redemption. But there's still the other story to be told. And so God has redone the Eden timeline on Venus, and he's sent Ransom the hero to basically beat the devil up, to beat the crap out of the devil so that he can't seduce the new Eve. And after this epic fight, he goes through this long subterranean journey. It kind of is a katabasis. It kind of is a descent into the underworld. But because it's Lewis, he has this idea that those regions, even though they look mysterious and chaotic and strange to us, they have an order. It just might not be meant for us. So here's just a passage from Lewis that sort of gets at this. He says, "For the rest of Ransom's subterranean journey, after his long sleep in the firelit cave, Ransom was lightheaded with hunger and fatigue. He remembers lying still after he woke for what seemed like many hours, and even debating with himself whether it was worth going on. The actual moment of decision has vanished from his mind. Pictures come back in a chaotic, disjointed fashion. There was a long gallery open to the fire pit on one side, and a terrible place where clouds of steam went up for ever and ever. Doubtless one of the many torrents that roared in the neighborhood here fell into the depth of the fire. Beyond that were great halls, still dimly illuminated and full of unknown mineral wealth that sparkled and danced in the light and mocked his eyes as if he were exploring a hall of mirrors by the help of a pocket torch. It seemed to him also, though this may have been delirium, that he came through a vast cathedral space which was more like the work of art than that of nature." This is the part that gives me the shivers every time that he touches up in the underground cavernous depths of the Venus, of the new Earth, essentially. He comes on what seems like a created structure, as in there are architects down here and people or something like people thinking. And this is incredibly eerie. Two great thrones on one end and chairs on either hand, too large for human occupants. I think this is kind of what the Cimmerians are meant to be too, this mysterious other people on the edge of the known world. If the things were real, he never found any explanation of them. There was a dark tunnel in which a wind from heaven knows where was blowing and drove sand in his face. There was also a place where he himself walked in darkness and looked down through fathom below fathom of shafts and natural arches and winding gulfs onto a smooth floor lit with a cold green light. And as he stood and looked, it seemed to him that 4 of the great earth beetles, dwarfed by distance to the size of gnats, and crawling 2 by 2, came slowly into sight, and they were drawing behind them a flat car, and on the car, upright, unshaken, stood a mantled form, huge and still and slender. And driving its strange team, it passed on with insufferable majesty and went out of sight. Assuredly the inside of this world was not for man, but it was for something, and it appeared to Ransom that there might, if a man could find it, be some way to renew the old pagan practice of propitiating the local gods of unknown places in such a fashion that it was no offense to God himself, but only a prudent and courteous apology for trespass. That thing, that swathed form in its chariot, was no doubt his fellow creature. It did not follow that they were equals or had an equal right in the underland. So Lewis here is kind of baptizing the myth of the katabasis. He's baptizing the story of going down into the unknown chaotic regions. So whereas for the pagans, there was the possibility that those regions really were chaotic, that is, they really didn't have a governing order. They were mere tohu vabohu, mere formlessness and void, with no spirit of God breathing. For Lewis, the case is slightly different. He's suggesting that the underworld realms have an order, it's just not ours, that there might be other and fresh creations. Of course, the Bible speaks of the angels or the Elohim and the gods beyond us, and Lewis is suggesting that there might be regions of space that we can't understand or can't yet understand, but that the hidden order of them is authored by the same mind that authors our order. That's not a possibility that's outright denied in the Odyssey, but it's certainly not a conviction that we're invited to believe in firmly. Instead, what we have is the darkness and the shades of death who come in this piteous desperation. I want to read to you now a passage where they start to approach. So remember, Odysseus has to slaughter sheep and then take the sheep heads and basically, or cut the sheep's head off and pour the blood into this pit. And I'm reading, as always, from my own translation here of book 11, near the beginning, when he summons the spirits of the dead. So this is like almost the flip side of the Iliad. If you think of the Iliad as an embroidered image where the ghosts of the dead flee down to the house of Hades after they're slaughtered in battle, now we flip the image and we see what happens to them after they go off stage. So here it is. And remember, Odysseus here is still narrating. He's telling the Phaeacians his story. He says, "Then at my prayers, when I'd called out to summon the clan of the dead, when I'd made my entreaties and cast down the severed heads of the sheep to the pit, and it flowed with their murky blood, they came flocking, the souls of the dead in the darkness, up from the land of their death, maidens and lads and old men with their years of sorrow on sorrow, and virgins, still tender in heart, still new to the shock of grief. Many others came gashed and still wounded, carrying brass-tipped spears, that's the soldiers like in the Iliad, men whom the wars had killed, their weapons still gory with man-flesh. Throngs of them pressed and jostled on every side of the pit with their otherworldly moans. I was gripped by a sickening fear." Yeah, I bet. There are so many innovations in the Greek. Talk about reasons to go to the Ancient Language Institute and study Greek. There are so many wonderful artistic flourishes here, and chilling ones. What I've translated as the souls of the dead in the darkness up from the land of their death. This is a reference to Erebus, and Erebus is one word for the underground realm or the house of Hades, but it means just darkness. So there's something inherent in darkness and in water, the black depths of the unseen ocean, from which emerge these forms without forms. They're not really life; they're more like memory. And one reason we know that is because Heracles, who does survive, who lives on, he isn't here. His shade is here. A kind of image or an after effect of him is here, like the faint image on a camera that is left by somebody that's moved on. But he himself is gone. So whatever human souls may be able to persist after death, they're not here. And most human souls, it seems, just evaporate into the chaos, and it takes the life of a living being and the blood of a sacrificed animal to draw them back like moths to a flame. There's also just an amazing phrase, the enthea necron. It's like the ethnia necron. And ethnos is a people, so it's almost like I've translated it as clan. It's almost like they're a family of some kind or a race of dead. So that after death, all races, all distinctions vanish, and it all becomes kind of one big family of dead people because there is no distinction among the shades. And then these images, the maidens and lads and old men with their years of sorrow on sorrow, and virgins, parthenikai tatalai, the tender virgins, and they're new to the shock of grief. They're neopenthea. It's almost like they've just arrived, just woken up in the house of Hades after their death, because they didn't, of course, expect to die so young. You have soldiers, gory soldiers, still bearing their wounds and carrying their spears. It's an incredibly gruesome image and grotesque and fearful. And what Odysseus says is that he's seized by a chloron deos, which means something like a yellow fear. And it's not quite yellow like we might say, oh, you're yellow. I think it's meant to say fear that turns him a sickening yellow-green. So I called it a sickening fear in the translation, but it's a good example of the sort of thing that you really have to get in the original and then draw it out as best you can in translation. So that's the scene that Homer sets for us. And you have to imagine that this is something you've never heard before, because now it's such an iconic moment that, of course, we've seen it repurposed and meditated upon and analyzed almost into oblivion. But what the audience must have felt when these shades, these spirits, I almost think of them as like two pairs of eyes that are bright and white against just a shadowy or shady backdrop, a kind of amorphous ghost. They can't speak unless he gives them the blood, so they're just crowding in silently around him with their war wounds hanging out and their blood and their spears. And then the old men that are polutletoi, they're laden down with many cares. I think I said with men with their years of sorrow on sorrow. But there's a nice little rhyme there between Odysseus, who is also much daring, much enduring, and these old men who have come to death. And so, of course, Odysseus now is staring in the face of his end. Whatever happens, no matter how his journey proceeds, no matter where he ends up going, even if he makes it home, this is how his story will end in some profound sense. And how can he recover meaning from that? How can he grip meaning from that? And how can he avoid the temptation to simply abandon life altogether? So I think, we're thinking about each of these episodes as paths not taken. I think we're really looking now at the ultimate path not taken for Odysseus. That is the path of death, the path of ending his existence in despair and nihilism. Because what's the point of anything? And we had a hint of that before when Odysseus, after the shipwreck, after the bag of winds was opened, he thought about pitching himself into the ocean. But now he's really confronted with why not? Why not do that? And I said before that there was an option for him to do that in the ancient world. It's not like this is a closed question. There were many ancient philosophies later on that would say, for instance, as in Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, just take your leave of life, take control over your death. Odysseus has opted against that, and his question now is why? Why do that? Why not just stay here among the land of the dead, where it turns out many that he loved are already waiting. They're already dissolved into shadow and shade. His mother is here. She has pined away with grief for him. His father will follow soon after, though he waits at home. And I want to read to you just one other passage from Paralandra, because this is a really astonishing interpretation of Homer that we get just in passing in C.S. Lewis's novel. So slightly earlier than the passage I read to you just before, when he's battling with Weston, who has been effectively possessed by Satan himself, Weston comes up for a minute from his slumber or his submergence in the satanic possession, and we discover that he has been in hell. And he says exactly what I just suggested, or he rather embodies what I just suggested, that the materialist, scientistic worldview of reality just as atoms crashing together can't sustain meaning. And Weston has now found that after your atoms dissolve, death really does come. And if there is no meaning outside the atoms, then you are left kind of in this formless chaos of meaninglessness. And he talks about all these horrible, people in Central Africa doing beastly things with masks on in the middle of the night. He says they know the truth of it. Children with their nightmares of finding dead people in their nursery, they know the truth of it. It's all tumble down faces and ectoplasm, and he portrays hell as this kind of unbinding, this dissolution of logic and reason where they take your head off and you can't connect one idea to another. And he says, and Ransom says to him, the hero says, nobody need go there. That is, if you hitch yourself to the meaning, the eternal meaning, the logos, then you can be saved from this. And Weston says, I know that's what you believe, but you're wrong. It's only a small parcel of civilized people who think that. Kind of like how the Bible has this one cosmology against all the other counter-chaos cosmologies, this idea that there is reason and mind and form before there is chaos is sort of this biblical idea that only takes place in this tiny little region. Humanity as a whole knows better. It knows, Homer knew, that all the dead have sunk down into the inner darkness, under the rind. He thinks of the earth or human life as a rind of time, 70 years or so that you pass through, and then you pass through the rind into darkness, all witless, all twittering, gibbering, decaying, bogeymen. Every savage knows that all ghosts hate the living who are still enjoying the rind, just as old women hate girls who still have their good looks. It's quite right to be afraid of the ghosts. You're going to be one all the same. Now, we shouldn't take Weston exactly at his word, because one of the things that Lewis reminds us in the Screwtape Letters is that the devil lies. So this is a uniquely pessimistic, in fact, definitively pessimistic view of the situation. And the Greek pessimism that Nietzsche describes, which is certainly an element of Greek thought about this, isn't actually, I don't think, the whole story, but it is certainly a reality that the ancient rituals and legends and folkways and spook cults around ghosts and demons, all these rituals kind of convey this possibility that there's nothing, that if a human existence, a human soul, is a limited thing by its body, then what you're going to be left with afterwards is kind of the shreds or the remains or the shards of your consciousness that have now been dissolved on the wind or the atomic gust of things. And it was to dispel this fear, by the way, that somebody like Epicurus would say, no, you won't be there at all. It'll just be the atoms, because you only exist when the atoms are in the right configuration. But the haunted fear, the Halowe'en fear of Odysseus and all these myths is that we won't fully expire. We won't be extinguished. We'll only be decomposed. And we do get that. We get Odysseus facing up to that. And one of the episodes where this really is driven home, I think, is when he encounters Elpenor, who's one of his crew. And Elpenor was back with him on Circe's island just a book ago. But, as he explains in the Underworld, or rather among the shades that have come from the Underworld, as Elpenor explains, he went upstairs to the roof one night when they were all drinking, and he was kind of drunk, and like, I have actually done this like at a frat party once in college. Maybe that's like revealing too much about my college years, but you get kind of disgusted by the party and you go upstairs to like look at the stars, and that's what Elpenor does. He just like gets out of the party, he goes up to sleep on the roof in the cool outer air, and then he's woken up by a noise in the night. He stumbles up, kind of hungover or maybe still drunk, falls off the roof and breaks his neck and dies. And so they sail away without him, and he has no tomb. And Odysseus is now confronted with the shade of his friend, as he will, in fact, in the end, lose all his friends to this shadow. And he's confronted also with his inability to do anything, really, for Elpenor. He can set up a tombstone for him, which he will do. And he says, you'll have memory among those who are living, and that's what Elpenor asks for. But he'll still be a shade. Elpenor will still be gone. And so the reason this is important is because this is Kleos. Odysseus is coming face to face with the poverty, the sheer inadequacy of the compensation that the heroes in the Iliad fought for. Remember, the whole Iliad is based on the supposition that although we die, we can for a moment strive with the gods, and after this we will get Kleos and we will live on in memory, which is to say we will live on in poetry and song, which is to say that's Homer's whole project. And now not only Odysseus, but Homer himself is up against the possibility that it is simply not enough. Because here we are staring at Elpenor, whose death is basically meaningless, just this random accident, this stupid mistake he made. And now it's all gone. And the only thing Odysseus can do is set up this tombstone. The only thing he can do is tell his story. The only thing Homer can do is write a song. And that's Kleos, for what it's worth. And this is profound. This is a brave artist in Homer who is willing to face up to this. Not many artists are. Most artists will give you kind of these flowery ideas about how their song will live on forever. And even sometimes in Shakespeare we get this, that, my song will live forever even though you shall die. Homer is willing to say, yeah, but what good will that do if we are gone? And we get this most profoundly, of course, in the confrontation with Achilles. So Odysseus meets the shades of various heroes that died in war. He's confronting, remember, always he's a veteran, so he's confronting also his memory of the lost comrades whom he left behind and those whom he doesn't really know anything, doesn't know about their fate. But he meets Achilles in the underworld, and he tries to console him for his death with Kleos. And he tries basically to grasp, not only for Achilles' sake, but for his own sake. Say, you were the greatest hero. If your greatness isn't enough, then what do we make of it for the rest of ourselves? So he says, compared to you, Achilles, no man was ever so utterly blessed, and none will ever be. Back in the day when you lived, we acclaimed you a god among men, we Argives. And now you're a great and powerful lord of the dead here below. So don't let death trouble you, noble Achilles. Don't grieve. You can hear the pleading in his voice. Me tithanon akakisdeo achilleo. Please don't grieve, because what does that mean for the rest of us? What does that mean for even those of us that make it home alive, who will ultimately pass away and die? And Achilles won't have it. Here's what he responds. It's one of the most famous lines in the poem. So Odysseus says, that's what I said, but he answered me back with the following words. Don't try to talk up death to me now, O dazzling Odysseus. I think there's an implication here that, Odysseus can sell you on anything, but he can't sell you on death. Silver-tongued, rhetorician, great talker, but don't try to talk up death to me now, O dazzling Odysseus. I would eagerly live as a field hand and work at the plow for a nobody with no fortune and hardly a scrap of land, than rule as a king over every last rotted and wasting corpse. Kata thimenoisin anasein nekuesi. That kata thimenoisin. Kata in Greek can be an intensifying preposition. So it's thimenoisin is for the decomposed ones or for the decayed ones. So kata thimenoisin is what I translated as rotted and wasting. This whole world is rotten. And that's what Achilles has to answer Odysseus for all his consolation, for all his hope, for all his hope to gild this with some kind of shining rhetoric, some sorts of words. And this sends us, I think, in Odysseus and Homer into an existential crisis, into a spiral. How can you go on living in the face of this meaninglessness? What kind of life is worth living in the face of death? He meets heroes, he meets wives of gods, he meets the mother of Heracles, he meets Jocasta. We get a lot of the material for later tragedy, both Jocasta, the mother of Oedipus, who hangs herself when she realizes that she slept with her son. We meet Castor and Pollux, who trade off days in the underworld. They alternate between life and death. We get Clytemnestra and Agamemnon's shade, telling how Aegisthus killed him. And Agamemnon even suggests that Clytemnestra has called all women's loyalty into question, that her actions have brought shame even on chaste women who have not betrayed. And Odysseus has to ask, has she? He certainly takes from Agamemnon the counsel not to be too open, not to be too vulnerable. He says, don't come home directly. Come home on some unknown port. Don't reveal yourself immediately. Test and try. Trust but verify, if anything, right? And so suddenly the very premise of his journey, the idea that when he gets home, he will have his identity, is being unraveled, called into question. And so Odysseus has to grapple with what to do about all this. He has a prophecy from Tiresias who outlines a number of possible futures for him, most of which hinge on whether or not he's going to be able to restrain his men from eating or killing the cattle of the sun. And that's an episode we'll get into down the line. But this is basically, he says, keep them back, because if you don't keep them back, then you will lose them all. They will all die. And you yourself, even if you yourself should escape, you'll arrive in a late and evil hour, your companions lost in a foreign ship. So this really is game time for Odysseus. This is when he has to stare death in the face, stare the reality of his death in the face, and decide whether anything is worth it in the face of this. And this is, I think, a question that I'm sorry to say people still confront. We don't know. None of us knows. I have faith, but I don't know what happens after death. Faith is not the same thing as having knowledge. In fact, that's the definition of faith. So we're all up against that great unknown in the realms beyond human life. And Odysseus doesn't know. In fact, he knows, if anything, less than those of us that were brought up on the Judeo-Christian tradition, which has a definite answer to these questions. He just has questions. Even though he's now faced with the shades, he knows there are other regions of the blessed, regions of the gods. Maybe ultimately there is an order to everything. He does not know. And in that unknowing, he has to confront the question whether to go on living and searching for a life and a home. Even though that home might be fraught with perils, even though he knows it's going to be more suffering, more danger, even though he's not even sure anymore whether he can trust that his home will be in array when he arrives to meet him, even though he suddenly has to wonder about Penelope's faithfulness. At this moment of deepest crisis and despair, he has to face a question that I know a lot of you guys listening have faced before, which is, what's the use of a life so filled with sorrow? What's the use of a life? How can we go on in this pain and this unknowing? And it's heavy stuff, but in that moment, we have to confront this, and I pray that each of us makes Odysseus' choice. Because I think in this book, Odysseus does the closest thing to believing, the closest thing to faith, recognizable faith that is possible in the pagan world. And that is this: if it's really true that Achilles, lord of men, who had all the world's goods, who was strong and handsome and proud and brave and rich and beloved, or at least feared, if after all that, Achilles would trade it all in for one more day of life on earth, Achilles would rather live as a field hand, as someone scraping a living out of the dirt on another man's farm, then maybe the wisdom of the house of death is this: even a suffering life is worth living. Even a life filled with pain, even a life of confusion, even this human life, this tragic life where we don't know what's on the other side, maybe even that life is worth it. It was worth it to Achilles. Achilles would have rather given up everything he had. And that's another interpretation besides the one that the devil gives in Paralandra. The devil says, well, if it's all death at the end, it's not worth it. None of it means anything. But another reading of this book is, well, if Achilles himself would happily live as a farmhand, would happily live in suffering and sorrow, maybe Odysseus too can choose the life ahead of him, even though it's full of uncertainty, full of more trials, full of more pain, full of more tears. And that's what he has to do. He has no other choice. He has no way forward but up, away from the shadows of death, and on with his journey, which is all that the rest of us can do. And we have the hope that there's more beyond death than just shadows. It's just an astonishing work of literature and art, and an image that endures because of how much it says in so little space and time. It captures so much in this story, and you can tell because, of course, everyone has spun it off and repurposed it and reworked it, and that's why you know that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a good movie, because it spawns a whole genre. And I'm always ambivalent about this, because on the one hand, genres are great, and genre fiction can be really good, and we need to be able to comment and riff on each other and all that, but they also bury and obscure the originality of the first conceit. Right now on rejoiceevermore.substack.com, I am reading the Paradise Lost aloud, and Paradise Lost has all these images in it that were so fresh at the time and have now become kind of cliched because everybody picks them up and kind of riffs on them and reuses them, and eventually they start to lose some of their freshness and originality. And that is one reason why I want to end this section of the Odyssey by recommending to you again Epic the Musical. This is I mentioned it before, it's a long kind of rock opera concept album that is based on the Homeric stories and the myths that surround them. And it is on Spotify, basically everywhere. I'll link to it in the description, in the show notes, if you're interested. But this is an interpretation, a retelling. It's not entirely 100% faithful. No reinterpretation is. But that's part of the point, because through this rewriting of the myths as a modern American rock opera, we get kind of to confront these issues again in a fresh new way. It's sort of like a new translation, but it's an adaptation, right? And in the Underworld, there's a great song sung, I'm pretty sure, by Tiresias to Odysseus about what's coming in his future. It's called No Longer You. And it's about this idea that having passed now through his moment of deepest despair, Odysseus is going to become a different person. And I think up out of Book 11 is a good sort of candidate for the basement of his story, for the nadir, for the bottom part of this plot arc, because he does, of course, go into chaos and then come out again with a sort of sadder but wiser demeanor. And after the slaughter of the cattle of Helios, if that indeed happens, Tiresias predicts, he sings this song in Epic. He says, I see a song of past romance. I see the sacrifice of man. I see portrayals of betrayal and a brother's final stand. I see you on the brink of death. I see you draw your final breath. I see a man who gets to make it home alive, but it's no longer you. And this is the transformation that Odysseus is going through now. I mean, transforming from the brash hero of war who believed in Kleos and who thought, like, you know, he had a hero's welcome awaiting him at home. Now the sad tragedy of the world has impressed itself upon him, and that one golden thread of that will still to live is going to carry him through even the pit of hell and out onward back home to become a new man who can meet Penelope. So it's a great little passage from Epic, which you should definitely listen to if you like Homer, and if you've been enjoying this walk through it. We will pick back up with book 12 next week. I believe we're on to book 12, because this was book 11. So that's the last kind of journeying book, and then we have the return back home, and then we'll be done. I've really appreciated all of your suggestions for new stuff to do. Major candidates at the moment for the next work to deal with on Young Heretics include the Aeneid, the 4 Socratic dialogues the 4 dialogues by Plato about Socrates' trial and death, the Dante's Inferno, and Beowulf. So it sounds like there's a lot of interest in epic poetry. Oh, and the Organon of Aristotle. There's kind of a wild card in there, one of the works of philosophy by Aristotle. So I'm kind of weighing those various options. If you want to vote for one or suggest another one, you still can. The lines are still open at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. That is also where you can subscribe to ask me a mailbag question. And so I have a mailbag question this week from Rejoice Evermore subscriber Vincenzo. And Vincenzo writes, I am enjoying the Homer series a lot. And in the Circe episode, this was last week, you summarize analysis of various allegories related to social, personal, familial, etc. structure. So he's saying I'm interpreting these stories for you, which of course I am. Yes, I'm translating them and reading portions to you, but I also hope that you'll go away and read them on your own and develop your own interpretations, because what you're getting here is my reading of the poem, and everybody's reading is just a little bit different. We all read the same poem, but we all come away with different ideas. You might even read a poem multiple times and come away with different ideas each time. And this is really what Vincenzo's question is about. He says, sometimes I wonder whether what we read into the poems, given our modern sensibilities and culture and the fact that we sit on the shoulders of millennia of literature, whether it was really read the same way or not, to what extent, by the Greeks and later other civilizations. Yeah, well, this is a major, major question of literary criticism and interpretation. And if you want to live the life of the mind, and if you want to have a reading life, you have to grapple with this at some point, especially if you read old books, which obviously you should. Because what other kinds of books are you going to read? Modern books? Come on. You're going to read some book called Light of the Mind, Light of the World, Illuminating Science Through Faith by Spencer Clavin? Are you going to go to Amazon.com and pre-order or order that book right now because it's available today? You totally should, but also, yes, you should read old books. You should read at least one old book for every modern book that you read. And that means you're going to have to face up to this question, can we ever get a fresh, true interpretation of an ancient poem like Homer's Odyssey in the way that the ancient audience would have heard it? And it can be hard to find any certainty about this, or to be confident about this, because there's so much that we don't even know about the ancient world. And then, as Vincenzo points out, we sit at the tail end of a literary tradition, or at least in the middle of a literary tradition, looking back through all these other lenses. And that's kind of what I was talking about when I was talking about franchises, right? It's like impossible to watch the Texas Chainsaw Massacre without thinking of it as a slasher, even though the people who saw the Texas Chainsaw Massacre for the first time might not have thought, oh, it's one of those slasher movies, like there always has to be a final girl, there always has to be this and that. Like, no, it was just a story that was being told, and somebody came up with it, it was original, you know? And there's a girl on Instagram, maybe she's on TikTok too, I don't know, who does these funny jokes about like the first time people came up with now obvious and basic cliches. Like the first time somebody said, I am rubber, you are glue. And it was like, oh, snap dog, like sick bird. And, you know, like when these things were fresh, they must have been really fresh. And I don't think we can ever recover that experience entirely, because I don't think anybody can ever live the life of anybody else entirely. That's why we have communication and translation, that these things are shared from a different perspective from every human mind. And that would have even been true in the ancient world, that somebody reading, you know, Homer after it was written down would have a different experience than somebody listening to it. Different people listening to it would have come away with different things. And you get very quickly what Harold Bloom called the anxiety of influence, that there's, you know, the fresh original stuff is in the past. And by the time of the Hellenistic era, you get people like Callimachus, who's one of these very almost postmodernist poets, kind of playing with and riffing ironically on the ancient epics. And you already start to feel like, well, how can we get underneath the surface to the truth and the reality of things? Now, when I come up on these sorts of questions, I sometimes feel like people want, you know, a hard and fast rule, because they want this to be a science. Because we, in our day, we want everything to be a science. We want everything to have a definite answer that we can work out and say, like, here's the 3 tips that will definitely solve this problem for you. It's not a science. It's an art. And art has its own value, but also its own logic and its own rules. One of Aristotle's best points is that you should be as specific as the discipline warrants, not as specific as you possibly can be. So there are some areas, human areas specifically, where a little bit of gray, a little bit of uncertainty is just part of the reality of the thing. So if you try to be more specific, if you try to nail down harder rules than human life allows for, you'll actually get less accurate and not more. And so when you deal with literary criticism, you are always dealing in gray areas. There's always room for error, and nobody's going to get it perfectly. But I'm going to suggest to you that that is actually a good thing, and here's why. Art means itself. Art doesn't mean something else. It's not there to produce a lesson or for you to draw away an interpretation or to furnish the material for your brilliant essay or your PhD thesis. It's there to be itself. And the underworld scene in the Odyssey is a perfect example of that, because there are so many allegorical interpretations, and I've given you some today that I think are valid and interesting, but there are so many of them, right, that you could sort of fall into the impression that there must be some one right one. Now, there are definitely wrong ones, right? If I said that the scene in the Underworld is just a power play, or it's just a game, a linguistic rhetorical game that Homer was playing, or it means that actually there are unicorns, like, you would be able to look at the text and say, any reasonable person can conclude that that's wrong. So it doesn't mean that anything is true, but it does mean that there's a whole range of things that you can take from this poem, because the art itself is a picture of something that is deeper than any one interpretation. So yes, you might encounter an Odysseus in the Underworld-like situation in your life, but you might also encounter a totally different situation where the underworld also applies in a different way, because the underworld itself is this rich symbol, and that's what symbol does. It kind of embodies something that is more than any one particular time or place, and that in that way, it becomes a template for all sorts of other human experiences. It's a spiritual reality, and spiritual realities aren't locked to any place or time. And so for us, trying to interpret, we are going to be interpreting in terms of our modern experience, our lived experience, as they say, but we're going to be trying always to do that by an authentic encounter with the text itself. And the way to do that is to keep the text, the thing itself, front and center, and never replace the text with your interpretation or with your interesting historical theory or anything like that. The text is the text, and you haven't actually gotten closer to it or gotten to, quote unquote, the meaning of it by interpreting. You've actually just drawn something out of it, but the text is an infinite well. So you come back to the reality of it, and you always try, I think, to start from that. So I think of interpretation and literary criticism kind of like a journey down into the underworld and back up again, an approach and then a retreat. Because there's two kinds. There's a kind of literary interpretation where you say, well, what were the facts, right? What was the history? What are the things I need to know in order to understand this poem, and not to get my own sort of biases in the way? And that means like knowing what the values were about marriage, for instance, in the ancient world, all the stuff that I sometimes, will go off on a little break and say like, well, in the 1200s BC, like this and this happened, the historical stuff. And that's the approach. That's the descent downward into the underworld. Because in the underworld, there is an image of reality, a human experience, a spiritual truth that is underneath the words of the text that can't be captured by any time-bound or specific thing, but is just the thing itself. And you're trying to get at that experience when you learn about the poem, when you learn about how it would originally have been delivered. You're trying to imagine yourself into that world so that you can receive a dose of this eternal thing that is the poem. And then, as you ascend back up out, changed by the journey, you can apply some lessons to your life. Like, hopefully, from this episode, you got the lesson that, living is better than not living if you have the option, right? That even a life of suffering is a worthwhile, meaningful life. And that's an interpretation that I've drawn, I think, authentically out of the text. But we can check me. And the way we can check me is we go back to the poem. And that's why I always read to you directly from the poem, because you have to be checking yourself against what the poem itself says. And if you find something in the poem that contradicts your interpretation, it doesn't mean your interpretation is entirely wrong. It just means that there's more to it than that, because there's always more to the text than what you can come up with in your kind of logical mind, in your interpretative mind. So never replace the original work of art with your theory. come back to the work of art to gain new insight, new theories, new knowledge. You approach it by finding out information about it, historical facts that get your prejudices out of the way. Kind of the opposite of the modern idea where you tell the poem what's wrong about it, how it's patriarchal or it's backwards or whatever. This is the opposite of that, clearing away your opinions and your prejudices and whatever to get at the poem as it was originally received and then drawing judgment out of it. I had a professor in grad school, one of my favorite professors, just a wonderful character, who was very stern. And you would bring her these essays with these brilliant ideas, and she would just interrupt you in the middle, because in Oxford you read your essays aloud. You'd read your essay, and she would interrupt you right in the middle and say, primary sources, chapter and verse. In other words, don't give me something that some scholar said. Give me what the book itself says and cite the line and tell me what it says and why you think it means this. And so always, always, always come back to the text and then draw out of it lessons and ideas and insight from your encounter between your soul and the art itself. Art means itself. It doesn't mean anything else. There's no other thing that you're supposed to be getting at or penetrating to, no right answer to the equation. But there is a real meaning there that can't be interpreted away or wished away. And what you draw out of that meaning can be more or less in line with the text, depending on how closely and carefully you are studying the work itself, because it's the art that matters, not the theory. The theory, guys like me, people who are here and explaining things to you, I hope that I provide a service, and I love to do it, and I could do it for my whole life, all the time, forever. In fact, that's kind of what I'm doing in my career. But we're just handmaids. We're doormen. We're doormen at the gate of this descent into the underworld of meaning that rests beneath the poem. And the minute you get more attached to the door than the building inside is the minute you've lost the plot. It's the thing itself you're trying to get at. And you get at it by learning as much as you can, by reading good introductions and notes. But then once you get at it, you draw out of that what it means to you, checking always against the thing itself and the author and what the author has written. I hope that helps. There's no hard and fast formula here, but think of it like an approach or a descent and an ascent. You go into the poem through historical knowledge and you come out through interpretation, but you always, always, always remember not to replace the text itself or the art itself with your interpretation, because art is itself. It's not anything else. It's not meant to be replaced by you, and you're not supposed to get in the way. You're supposed to get out of the way. All right. Been a joy as always. Really loving this deep dive version of Young Heretics. Looking forward to doing more. Once again, my book is out today. Light of the Mind, Light of the World, Illuminating Science Through Faith. I will drop the link, of course, in the description of this episode. And you can get that. You can go to rejoiceevermore.substack.com to become a subscriber, ask me mailbag questions, make suggestions. And if you like the show, share it around. Let people know. Word of mouth is how books and podcasts succeed. So I would really be grateful if you could let people know however you let people know about things. Text your friends, tweet about it, write about it, whatever. Just spread the word. Thanks as always, and I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.